No, I can be organic. We're going to talk about mountains today?
That's right.
Okay.
Was
okay,
that you being organic?
I can't be organic.
Was that? I was waiting for it. You wrote some checks that your mind could not cash.
Hey, we're cashing those checks as we speak, buddy.
Yeah,
sometimes banter just needs to be banter, bro.
Sometimes you just gotta. If you can't think of anything, then just be meta about it and talk about how you can't think of anything. Right? That's being real, being authentic.
This is what the kids like these days, Mike.
Oh,
this
so
is, and our authenticity is what separates us from the chaff.
That's right.
That's my thought.
Yeah.
You're welcome. You're welcome, listeners.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
And welcome back to this episode of the Voyage podcast, where Jacob and I are going to be talking about one of the things that you see so much in the old mythological stories, the new mythological stories, but in our Christian mythological stories, yep, that's right, is the presence of a mountain, or the presence of the holy mountains. And one of the cool things that really resonated with me was you not only see it in the Old and New Testament, is this presence of a holy mountain, but it's been continued on throughout all of Christian history. And that's going to be one of the things that Jacob and I are looking forward to talking about too, is how is this tradition of the holy mountain continued even into, Christianity, or modern Christianity, so to speak. How's that sound, Jacob? Sound good? Sound ready for that?
I'm actually.
Or are you going to continue to be authentic? Is that what you were hoping for?
I think I'll contribute to this conversation. Okay. I think this is a fairly abstract idea. If only there was an outline. Put some
meat on these bones.
Referenced or something. Skeleton. But really, all I keep getting is just like, rock music riffs going on in my head. Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, so, or maybe a little Led Zeppelin.
I was hoping you were going to say like a Stairway to Heaven thing, because that's actually what I was hoping you were going to, if you wanted to actually tie it in.
Well, there is a lady who's sure that all that glitters is gold, Mike. And she's buying a Stairway to Heaven. So, what? That worked.
Yeah. It worked in the sense that it enlivened the dead air. Is that what you were?
I thought you were about to say killed the inertia of the conversation. Maybe it did both.
I was almost going to say killed the dead air, and I was like, no, that's redundant. It had to have enlivened the dead air, because you gave some sound vibrations to it. So the first question that I want to get into, because
let's
if I may, is so. Before we get into the examples, actually, because there's tons of examples, and I said again, we're going to be talking about Christian stories, Christian myths, sacred stories, and the non-Christian ancient myths, where we've seen mountains play such an important role. But first, why are the mountains sacred? Why are mountains sacred in general? Why do we see all of these stories in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, but also outside of Revelation? Why are mountains always so sacred?
Because they're in the sky, Mike.
Okay,
where the gods live. Have you heard of this book? Do you want a fuller answer than that? That's the equivalent of saying.
Indulge me. Indulge me for a second. Yeah, I did say why. At least it wasn't a yes or no answer.
That's true. I said they're in the sky. But have you ever heard of that book? Jonathan Pageau is a big inspiration for me. He does the symbolic world stuff on YouTube and in other areas and things like that.
Stop angling to get us signed on by Ancient Faith Radio. It's never going to happen. They'll never bring us on.
Maybe they'll pay me better.
They'll make you dump me is what they'll do.
Here's the ironic part is Jonathan Pageau has nothing to do with Ancient Faith Radio. So, How dumb do you
that's true.
feel? Yeah.
Yeah.
He's got his own things going on. He has a brother as well. One of those things he has going on is a brother named Matt too, because they're all French Canadian, and I'm pretty sure it's just Matthew, but it's French Matthew, so it's like Matthew.
You sound sophisticated. Keep going.
Yes. I'm sorry, Matt. I'm just gonna call him Matt. Matt Pajot wrote a book called...
I bet he likes to go by Jonathan's brother. That's how he prefers to be.
Well, maybe he should have become world famous by hitching his wagon to Jordan Peterson, and then he could be the person we're talking about. But he wrote a book called The Language of Creation. Have you ever read that by chance?
So I've started going into it. I do have an ebook of it, and yeah, I've started going into, like, I'll find a relevant chapter if it's going to be on something that we're either going to talk about, or so I haven't gone from page 1 all the way to the end. It's been more like piecemeal. But
no, and that makes sense. Honestly, when you start to read that book, it's almost like reading like a high school textbook or something like that. It's like you don't necessarily just sit there and like read a math book from like start
There's a lot of diagrams.
There's a lot of diagrams.
I found helpful.
Extremely helpful. Yeah, it's super visual. And we're going to get to super visual being an important element of a kind of pre-modern.
Yeah.
In any era, like, humans are visual creatures for the most part. I'm not being exclusionary.
If you hadn't done that whole buildup of saying that it's Jonathan's brother, I would have said it's a symbolic world out there. But you already took the wind from my sails a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Mike, it's a symbolic world out there, and there's this great book called.
And you had the better soundbite. Oh man. Jeez,
no, this book is fantastic though, honestly, and it's what's really cool about The Language of Creation as a book is that it's just written by a couple of laymen. It's fundamentally Matt's project. I think that he actually gets the impression that he kind of had like a significant influence on Jonathan, just because he kind of had the right kind of like brain for it, let's just say, where he was able to really investigate the nature of how humans engaged with the reality around them and how that applies to the scriptures, how that applies to ancient mythology as such. And so this book, The Language of Creation, is all about exploring how humans perceive things and why things that seem so nonsensical to us. If you're reading through the Torah, if you're reading through the Levitical law and things like that, all the things that atheists like to make fun of, like, oh, you can't put cotton and
mixing,
you can't mix fabrics together, textiles together,
eating shellfish,
right? Yeah. All the stuff they make fun of. There's a coherence to all of that comes straight from just a perspective of life, a perspective of how culture is built and how humans relate to the environment and the world around them, physically and spiritually, right? And it's because those things haven't been divorced in the ancient mind that you have things that strike modern people as very, like, surreal, like absurd even. It's because we all just live in our heads. And I don't think that we realize how little we have removed, how much we've like kind of gnosticized ourselves against the physical, and how meaningless the physical is in our. We don't feel that way. I'm sure that 99% of people don't feel like they treat the physical world as a big nothing burger, right? I'm sure they are convinced that they are very much in the physical plane.
Living in reality is living in purely what you can see or sense, experience. And so,
and so how could we,
not knowing what you don't know,
well, and it's as such, because of that, like, they don't understand that the physical nature of things is more than just like stuff. I'm not saying that people are not living in material reality. Obviously they are, but they treat material reality like it's outside of them, and they treat material reality like it's conditional, that it's just nominal. It's whatever I say it is. It's however I treat it that matters. It itself doesn't matter until I make it matter. Our language, when I keep using the word matter, because That goes back to so much about our English language. If you really dig into why we use the words we use, when I say something matters, it's because I'm talking about it has physical weight, that it has a weight upon my life. And people feel like nothing matters until they make it matter. And what that kind of means is that people are just floating through life until they notice something. And then when they notice it, and if they decide that it has some kind of significance for them, then they will give it material weight. Then they will say, oh, it matters now. But the ancients didn't feel like they were the deciders of what matters and what doesn't. They were in much more of a kind of reciprocal relationship, in my opinion, anyway. So mountains,
and so so what is that? Well, in one sense, because I think at least what I'm sort of grabbing at it too is that when you had this relationship to reality, where you feel that most acutely, right? And not that you want to jump all the way to the point of insignificance, but where people will feel they're least significant is when they're in the face of or confronted with this huge physical structure like a mountain. And so I think that's where, when we want to talk about the transcendent, it's like the mountain is something that reminds us very much of that. And that's actually why what I was trying to get to when you said, that's where the gods are. Why are mountains sacred? Well, why did they say the gods were on the mountain? It's because that's when you're most confronted with your, again, not that we think that humans are insignificant, but from a purely material standpoint, that is when you feel the most insignificant, is when you're confronted with this enormous, non-man-made, right? We can't take credit for it, physical structure. And from an ancient standpoint, that would have been the biggest thing, right? I mean, other than the sky itself, which, they thought the gods and the heroes were up in the stars too, right? They thought that the stars or the planets were gods. So it's the same idea, right? But here's the difference between the mountain and the sky. Because again, why were the gods on top of the mountain is because it was up in the sky. And oftentimes if it was, enshrouded in clouds, then it was obscured, you couldn't see it. But the role that the mountain served is the mountain was that meeting place between heaven and earth, the meeting place between heaven and earth. And so what role did the mountain play? Or again, why did it make it sacred? Well, from any worship standpoint, the meeting place between heaven and earth, between the gods and humanity, would be an altar. And so that was the touch point. And so what did mountains look like? Or what role did they serve? Is they became earth-made, not human-made, but earth-made altars all across, all across the land or all across the world. And that's why we start to see every single mountain, right? Ancient civilizations, ancient communities, they always had some sort of mythology, some sort of story that had to do with the gods and had to do with worship and had to do with sacrifice. Does that sound familiar? Like any Bible story you may have heard of, Jacob?
Sure. Well, let me just go reiterate, so the most frequent, I think one of the most frequent anyway, things that you'll find in just like the study of like religious man, right? Anthropology type stuff is this monoliths, right? That get erected everywhere. And it's in the Old Testament too, whenever like Jacob has a dream and, he's wrestling with God and things like that. When he wakes up, he goes and he erects an altar, he sets a stone up.
And what was that dream of too, right?
Oh, the ladder is going up and down. Yeah.
Well, it was a
really
ziggurat,
good point.
right?
Really good point.
It was ziggurats were just man-made mountains, but anyway, go
exactly.
ahead.
No, absolutely. We'll get into ziggurats for sure. But I'm just starting even smaller, where like, even if you're not looking at, ziggurats, just think about the fact that basically what people do is they create little mini mountains. Like, let's get a big stone and let's like set it down. And it's like a little miniature. It's like a little icon of a mountain, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing. And this is like a universal human language. Monoliths, the technical term for these kind of Stonehenge, like just giant stone pillars that get erected, are just everywhere. And they're really, really old. They've been around forever, They're just some of the oldest outside of cave paintings or funeral rites, because people can find old really, really, really old grave sites where there's obviously
Mhm.
some kind of like religious ritual at play. It's like those three. It's like you want to talk
Yeah.
about like the earliest kinds of human ritual worship. Uh, Cave painting, funeral rites, and monoliths, setting up little mini
Mhm.
mountains, you know?
And
So,
that's when they discover those, that's how they know that it's Homo sapiens sapiens, right? A more human community, or human community that's closer to us, our ancestors, than something that's closer to the primates, is when they have, like you said, those specific elements. One of them being, right, monoliths, or or the altars, or funeral rites is of course a huge thing, because the concept of praying for your dead, or having some connection to your ancestors when they're not physical anymore, when their body's not right in front of you, that speaks to that kind of higher level human thinking, sort of thing too.
well, and so there's always this sense of like a liminal space, right? And so
Mhm.
when we're talking about sacred geography, to use fancy jargon, um, there's this sense that there are some areas of the world that, it's easier to encounter the gods. It's easier to encounter, and like this is something we've never lost. This is why some people say I'd rather take a walk in the woods than go to church on Sundays, right? Well,
Mhm.
I can find God out in the woods, right? To some extent, that's true. I mean, it's not a good excuse not to go to church, and it loses a whole lot of reasons why people go to church. But what
Yeah.
is valid about that sentiment is that God is out in the woods too, right? And there
The
are some
reason why
areas.
people always use that and not sit in front of my TV is because they see something different about, going into nature, or going out into the woods, or climbing a mountain, climbing a
Or
hill.
climbing a mountain in this case.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and the mountain really is the best kind of liminal space in this regard because, going all the way back to ancient times, I think that you do have just the simplicity. And I mean this not in a negative way, in a positive way. Just the simplicity of the fact, like, it's up in the sky. The sky's where the gods
Yeah.
live, It's just kind of self-evident in those terms, right? It also takes a lot of work to get to the top. Kind of like what you kind of made some allusions to this, right?
Well, and we're actually going to have, and I know I always give you a hard time about teasing future episodes, so we are going to have a future episode on the pilgrimage, or the spiritual journey, which goes hand in hand with the mountain. Not that every pilgrimage has to be up a mountain necessarily, but those are two ideas, or two concepts that definitely go together. So like you said, they're oftentimes associated with a pilgrimage or a spiritual journey of some kind too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You are ascending, right? Like you are going up to meet the gods, like you're going up into the sky. When you get up top, you have a view of the world that is more profound than the view you had at the bottom of the mountain. So like there's just lots of really, really obvious, not just symbols, but like realities where being on top of a mountain gives you a different view. It gives you a bigger view, a broader view. It took a lot of work to get there. And so there's a sense of refinement. There's a sense of purgation about like the effort that it takes to get to the top. And you're up in the sky where the gods are.
I'm glad you brought that up, because you're never going to believe what Dante uses as his symbol for purgatory is a 7-layered mountain, or a 7-story mountain. And each of the stories, each of the levels is associated with one of the 7 deadly sins, because on each floor, he's being purified of that sin. And once you're purified of one sin, you move up to the next one. And so you're eventually purified. And then actually on the top, which kind of brings us into one of our biblical examples, on the top of Mount Purgatorio is the Garden of Eden, which brings us to our first mountain, like dwelling place of God, dwelling place of, the gods, so to speak. If you want to use like lowercase g gods for Adam and Eve, or like heroes, like ancient mythological heroes kind of examples.
Okay.
But the Garden of Eden was on top of a mountain. And it wasn't just because Dante said so. Dante puts it there because that was already present in the medieval Christian mind, but ancient Christian mind too.
Well, so rivers flow out of it, right?
Yep. Yeah. So you
and
have
they flow out it from every side, right? There's a river flowing out from every direction. And so it's at the top of a mountain. Right?
I mean,
Like, I mean, that's how you know that it's in the center of something where if everything on either side of it is flowing down, then it must be the pinnacle of something, right?
Mhm.
And that's something that's actually really self-evident in the Genesis account because of what I just said, and yet it is not anything I ever thought of until, listening to things recently like Jonathan Pageau or the Lord of Spirits podcast, because they point this stuff out. I mean, the Lord of Spirits podcast has done a ton on sacred geography and brings a lot of this stuff to light. They have a whole episode, I think, on sacred geography as such, where they talk about mountains and things like that. But really, it was the Pageau stuff that first introduced me to it. But you're right. Like, this is all in the Middle Ages and things like that. It gets thrown out when the kind of like mythopoetic nature of like middle-aged thought gets thrown out, like in the Enlightenment. And then suddenly you're left with the idea that the Garden of Eden is like my backyard, only bigger and full of zoo animals, like.
Well, and the idea of recreating Eden is actually significant. I know that that's not entirely what you were trying to bring it up as, but this is what we'll kind of get into when we move from the outside of the mythological and the ancient, like biblical examples into the post-biblical Christian examples, because that's what we start to see on some of the monasteries, is that their monastery is supposed to be a recreation of Eden. And where do they often build them? On mountains, right? One of the most famous Eastern Orthodox monasteries is
don't get me started on this, bro.
I know. But what was it? I mean, it was supposed to be a, and again, all of the they're all the monasteries, and the church itself is supposed to be a return to Eden. And so you'll see, and actually, like I said, the churches themselves are supposed to be similar, using similar mountain imagery. One of the examples, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but in Catholic churches, if they're built the way they're supposed to be, the sanctuary and the altar is supposed to be elevated above where everybody in the congregation sits. And the significance of that is, again, because mountains themselves were earth-made altars. When we make altars, they have to be raised or elevated just like the mountain, because that's where you're meeting God. That's the meeting place between humanity and God, is on the altar. Now, again, from a Christian standpoint, it's in the person of Jesus, but where does Jesus show up at the Divine Liturgy, at the Mass? On top of the altar, right? That's where the consecration happens. And so it all kind of fits together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We've only gone through Eden. What are some of those other mountain examples in? I actually wanted to do like Greek mythology first.
I was about to say, I mean, like, do you want, all right, so like, yeah, I mean, just in general, right?
Sure. I got the biblical ones too, but
yeah, the Bible's full of this, right? But
yeah,
obviously Mount Olympus is that's
like the first one that comes to my mind too.
Yeah, kind of iconic.
But the significance is, again, like you said, it's the dwelling place of the gods. Because actually, some of the other examples that I have, they have different kind of purposes. But Olympus specifically is the dwelling place. Because if you think of Eden, what did God do? Is he dwelt, or he walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. And so you get the sense of intimacy, of union, of communion with humanity and God on Eden. And that's what Olympus was, right? Not that humanity would get there, but that's at least where the gods were.
Yeah, well, and this is just ever present in, I mean, so if you look at this kind of brings back up the whole ziggurat idea. So on the one hand, there's natural mountains, and all those natural mountains always have temples on top of them. Yeah, all over the world, everywhere. This is a universal human language. It was the default to put your temples on top of high places, right? Yeah. And don't get me wrong, these mountains don't have to look like Everest. In some sense, like Jerusalem's on top of a mountain, right? And I've never been to Jerusalem, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like, it doesn't look like the Arizona desert, but I'm just going to say that. It just looks like, a kind of like hilly desert region, right? And so a mountain doesn't necessarily need to be a super high peak. it can just be an elevated place. This goes back to your pointing out that the altar is always at an elevated place. That's true in the Orthodox Church as well. Wherever it's able to be done, that's the appropriate thing to do. But this might be a little bit of a tangent. Like some of the churches that I've been in, especially like little mission churches, that are usually taking place in environments that don't have the luxury of being iconographic in their construction. Well, we still treat it like the high place. And we still call it the high place, right? We still engage with it as if it's above us, right?
There's a very famous photo of a priest in like a battlefield. So like a chaplain, a military chaplain, and he's performing mass on the hood of a Jeep. And so it doesn't have to be, like you said, so raised above. And the idea is that the people, the soldiers, they were kneeling or sitting on the ground. And the idea is if it's at least above the ground, right, it would be inappropriate to have the quote unquote altar, because it wouldn't really be an altar, but an altar on the ground at the same level where the soldiers like are sitting. And, or not just soldiers, but anybody. And so the idea is that even if it's just raised, just like you said, that symbolic value of it's raised just a little bit higher. And what's significant too is, and I don't want to say it's exclusive to Catholic as opposed to, I agree. I think it was the same, their obviously altars are elevated too, but when the priest, they have a special part at the mass, at the liturgy, that's called the elevation. And so it has to be elevated even above, wherever the altar is too. And so it just speaks again to exactly what you're talking about it's a raised surface, a raised, it's a meeting point again.
Well, and it's a relational thing. It's a relative thing. It's a relationship thing. So mountains don't have to be high peaks, right? They can be big hills or whatever, right? We're talking about kind of like a sacred way of describing things and engaging with things. That's rooted, but it's fundamentally rooted in the physical, in our experience of the physical. And if we have symbols of mountains, even if there isn't a mountain present, like in the case I gave of, churches being built in places that are not high places, or altars that are not on high places, well, we are still invoking the high places, even if we don't have the luxury of being in a high place per se. And if your church is just on like a little hill, well, that hill becomes a mountain. That hill is a mountain in this kind of sacred language type thing. But, the ziggurats, in some cases, the ancient solution is if you didn't have a mountain to put your temple on, but you wanted, you just make your own. And so
that's just it. And that's we have go ahead. Yeah.
No, just, what you're about to say, we're probably just
Tower of Babel.
Well, the Tower of Babel is, I wasn't necessarily going to say Tower of Babel, but there you go. That is all that is a ziggurat.
Yeah.
My thought of this was always informed by like some of like the Renaissance paintings that look like the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Yeah.
Which I still like that image. It's a fun image and I enjoy it. But it's much more like Apocalypto. Did you ever see that one with the Mel Gibson
like the
flick?
Aztecs, Mayans, the Incas, they all have those, which I think is really interesting that you'll see ziggurats not only in Babylon, right, but also on the other side of the world in the South American or Central American, native lands. And so
it's also even in Asia and things like that.
So it speaks to
universal.
how ubiquitous it is. Yeah. And so, because I always bring that up to my students, because they probably are sick of hearing me talk about it all the time, but I always go back to this mountain thing, because I said to them, like, it wasn't just about building a tall tower. That's not the issue. Like if that's the only thing you see in that story, then you're missing the point of the story. It was an act of idolatry, was what the Tower of Babel was. It was an act of, we don't want God to be the one that determines our relationship. We want to be the one who conditions that relationship. And so it was them putting themselves in the place of God, as opposed to God establishing or God setting the terms, so to speak.
Yeah,
and that was the issue with the tower.
Oh, well, it was, humanity was supposed to go and populate the earth. Humanity was supposed to go travel abroad, settle down, do things. Instead, they congregate. Instead, they stick together and they form a kingdom, an empire, a geopolitical space. And the pinnacle, no pun intended, of that was this grand tower, this grand temple structure that they were going to use. And then, as the Lore of Spirits podcast will tell you, it was a concept of trying to control God through this tower technology, through this mountain technology, so as to enter into a kind of quid pro quo type relationship with, God himself. And when he undoes this through the scattering of language, through the scattering of communication, and, by extension, forces human beings to fulfill what he intended them to do, which is to go their separate ways and form different communities around the world and things like that. His means of undoing their plans is to deconstruct them at the social level, right?
Yeah.
They literally can't even communicate anymore,
Well,
which if you think about America in the 21st century,
Yeah.
Are we not communicating well anymore? Anyway.
Yeah. No, a new confusion, which, sometimes people might see as like, some sort of the information highway getting disrupted or something, the telecommunications getting disrupted. It doesn't have to be all conspiracy theory, but it's sort of like, it kind of feels like the same sort of thing. Actually, before that, so we skipped in, you keep saying about how the people were meant to go out and repopulate the earth. Well, why? Because of the flood. And we actually have an example of where does the ark end up after the flood, but on top of Mount Ararat. And so it's another example of a sacred mountain, because now it's supposed to be a new Eden. You have all of the animals, you have the representatives of humanity on the top of a mountain. And the first thing Noah does when he gets off is make a sacrifice, and God makes a covenant. And so you have this sacred mountain example again. And we can go, there's obviously a ton that we go into in terms of like a new creation, a new Eden, but it's fitting that it ends up on top of a mountain, just like Eden was on top of a mountain. And Tower of Babel, like we've already said, that was supposed to be, that wasn't an earth-made mountain, that was a man-made mountain. That was a relationship with God on my terms, or on humanity's terms, not on God's terms. And so if you keep moving forward, we have, where does Abraham offer Isaac? It is
a mountain. He climbs up.
It's on Mount Moriah.
Mount Moriah. I couldn't think of the name of it.
So we have another. Mount Moriah is going to come into play a lot, right? Because we're going to see Mount Moriah come back. Like at the end of like MCU movies, it'll show the black screen. It'll say Iron Man will return in. Blah, blah, blah. It'll be like Mount Moriah will return in. David and the threshing floor, and Solomon building the temple, and even post biblical. That's where the Dome on the Rock is, because that's where Muhammad ascended into heaven, I think, or was assumed into heaven. I think that's
pretty rusty on that.
I think that's in Islam. That was But anyway, Mount Moriah is, again, you have the greatest sacrifice in pre-Christian Judaism, and I mean in Judaism, but in the offering of Isaac, and it's where like that becomes the place of Abraham's faith. That's why it's called the Dome on the Rock. That's the rock, and so that becomes the place where Abraham's faith was tested, but also where it was shown, and that actually ends up being the reason why God wants the temple built there by Solomon hundreds of years later.
Sure.
So Mount Moriah is going to be, a big one.
No, it is. It's the type of situation where it's just interesting how we this is going to be kind of random, but even here in America, if you look at our Washington DC area, right? Capitol Hill is where Congress is, right? And it is actually, if you ever travel to visit DC and you're on the National Mall, you know, the National Mall sits not in the shadow, quote unquote, but beneath Capitol Hill, right? Capitol Hill is kind of, and then on the other side of the National Mall, there is the Lincoln Memorial, which is a temple. It's literally just a Greco-Roman temple. Literally. It's exactly what a temple. It's exactly what a temple was.
You just replace Zeus with Abraham Lincoln.
You just put Lincoln instead of Zeus in there. And that is on top of a bunch of stairs. Like, it's elevated.
It's an altar. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is a temple mount. So you have all these kind of mount structures happening, even secularly within the context of our, nation and all that. We live in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has one of the coolest government buildings. Our Capitol building in Wisconsin's gorgeous. It's really, really pretty. And
as you're making the drive up the street,
you're going up a hill.
Yeah, it's very much, it's
on top of a hill. And then even when you get to the top of the hill, it's on top of a bunch of stairs. Like, you still have to ascend up to the government building.
You know what?
In Madison.
That actually reminds me. So I grew up in St. Paul, and I still live in Minnesota, but if it's similar situation, the Capitol building in Minnesota it's on an elevated space in St. Paul, but actually you have to go up even higher to go to the cathedral, which I think is appropriate.
Nice.
So the cathedral is just a little bit, which
and you wonder why they hated the Catholics back.
Yeah, as it should be. Well,
you have all the Protestants building their government building and all that stuff. Then you have like the Catholic Church come in and build something just a little bit higher next to it.
To that point, though, that's actually that was the church's strategy whenever they would whenever they would go to new areas or new territories. You'll see this a lot, actually, even much closer to us in our sort of area. Because there's a lot of kind of hills and bluffs in where we live, and you'll see this where there's a small town in Minnesota where they build the church on the top of the hill. And that was actually a common strategy of missionaries when they would go to a new space, is they would build the church on the highest point of the town, of the city.
I see.
Which obviously it has a practical or functional value, because then the cross is the first thing you see as you're traveling into a new town. So it's got that kind of component, but it follows very much with what we've been talking about, where, the meeting place, that a Catholic church was the meeting place between God and humanity, right on the altar. And so they were fitting that they had that same symbolic value to it.
Well, so, I thought you were moving us towards talking about the Shrine of Guadalupe here in the La Crosse area.
So that's not even the one I was originally talking about, but that's another example.
Not. I think I know what you're talking about. But one that is a very public structure that it's a pilgrimage site, is Our Lady of Guadalupe Shrine that was established here right outside La Crosse. La Crosse is bluff country, as Mike was pointing out. If you Google the Coulee region, Coulee, that's just French for bluffs, I think. Or I just made that up. You decide.
I can't fact check that.
I'm pretty sure that's true. Might be making it up. But
it's true enough.
It feels true. It sure sounds true. This is a really pretty area of the world, and it's nothing but hills and bluffs and, things that rivers have carved out and things like that. And on one of those bluffs is this huge shrine that was established here. It's one of my favorite things that was done in this area. So good job, Catholics. I'll give you that.
We didn't call it the Shrine of the Theotokos, though. That's probably what you were. But you know what?
I know.
It's the same. Yeah, same.
How do you say Theotokos in Spanish?
Is there a Greek to Spanish translate? I feel like that should be simple enough. Yeah, but Spanish is a Romance language, so it may feel a little clunky.
Well, and the punchline of that joke should just be saying like "Mother of God" in Spanish, I think.
Probably, yeah.
I'm going blank here in live
Madre
podcasting.
de Dios? Is that
sure?
Are you actually trying to do
how you would say
Madre
that?
de Dios, Mother of God?
That makes sense. Yeah, that sounds real.
I mean,
fact check him too if you want. You can check it. You can Google Coulee, and then you can Google Madre de Dios, and let us know who's accurate.
You've got a like Day of the Dead skeleton behind you, and you're gonna be like such a poser and not know Madre is mother.
I'm just kidding. I know.
Dios is God.
I was kidding. I knew that you were correct. Don't be so sensitive. But anyway, really, really awesome giant. It looks like a fairy tale castle. It looks like as you're driving like on the road. In the summer months, it can be kind of hidden in all the trees and foliage, but
the new atheists are going to be all over that one. Yeah, it is a fairy tale castle. Like, yeah, I know.
You know what? Yeah, I don't feel owned. I live in a more magical world than you, sir. But you have to take a path up to get to that thing. You actually, it's like a quarter mile. And, for folks who need assistance, they have golf carts and they'll like take you up there. But a lot of people end up walking the kind of pilgrimage path, and you literally like walk up to the top of it.
And to that point, there's actually, even before you get to the top, since we're talking about mountains, we're talking about sacred. So if you go to the chapel on the way, they actually have their votive chapel with all the candles. And you can like, that's like representing a prayer rising up to God, but they do it in the shape of a Aztec ziggurat. That's why it's in the shape that it is.
Is
so
that really why it's that shape?
It's supposed to, because that's what Our Lady of Guadalupe was.
Right.
She was going to the Aztec people in present day Mexico. So that's why they built it in the way that they did.
Oh, wow. That really contributes.
Yeah, so you got another sacred mountain, another sacred prayer mountain.
No, yeah, like, just to paint you a picture of this, folks, you walk into the chapel. The chapel itself looks like a, kind of European style chapel or whatever, just kind of like stone facade or whatever. But inside of it, it's what I would have called like a pyramid. Just like a pyramid of candles, right? But ziggurat, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But anyway, come to La Crosse sometime. Mike will host you. He's really inviting like that. Yeah.
Yeah. We got tons of room in my house.
Yeah.
We got tons of room in my house with all my kids.
You can bunk with his kids. I mean, well, okay. Anyway.
I feel like you're bringing up a safety concern. So what other biblical mountains, since we're kind of on this track right now? We got Abraham, the binding of Isaac on Mount Moriah. Moses has a ton of stuff on mountains. I don't know if you've heard.
So much mountain stuff in Moses.
Mount Horeb is where God calls Moses and reveals the name of God. You can't think of a more intimate union between God and man than God revealing the name on Mount Horeb. Well, I should say for now you can't, right? God then receives the 10 commandments, Moses receives the 10 commandments from God on Mount Sinai.
That's true.
Mount Sinai. Thank you. Ratifies the covenant. And I always have the disclaimer, Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai, some people see as the same, like different words for the same, which we don't need to quibble about now, but either way, it's still a mountain. You also have, do you remember the last one? With Moses?
With Moses?
Here's my hint. It's the last thing with Moses.
I was about to say, like, God takes him up to a mountain to show him the promised land. And then he says you can't go there because
So Moses dies on the top of Mount Nebo.
And he gets buried by God.
Yeah, and there's even you can find it's an apocryphal, I don't know if it's Jewish or if it's Christian, but the Assumption of Moses. And so you have this. And actually, if you look in the letter of St. Jude in the New Testament, he talks about the Jewish tradition of St. Michael and the devil fighting over the body of Moses.
Yeah.
And so there is this tradition of after Moses died, he was assumed into heaven, right? Not in the same way that the Theotokos, that Mary was. But that's also one of the reasons people will talk about why he was present at the Transfiguration.
In the same way that like Elijah was taken to heaven in a fiery chariot or in some sense Enoch.
And Elijah's is a really good one because he actually was at the lowest point. And so it's kind of a cool, almost like parallel between Moses was on top of a mountain. Elijah was assumed from the lowest point in the promised land or in the Holy Land. And so you kind of have but then they're both present. And where was the transfiguration, Jacob? On Mount Tabor.
Mount
Tabor as well.
That's right.
And so you have, there's a very kind of, what'd you say, like, poetic flavor to all of these events. But
if you want to get into Jesus mountains, we
haven't even
the New Testament is full of you're the one that brought up the Transfiguration.
I know, and only because well, we're gonna get to the New Testament because if you want to, let's finish up our Old Testament because we've got David.
You're steering this shit, bro. You're climbing this mountain. What are the people that take you up Mount Everest called? Like
Sherpa.
Sherpa. You're Sherpa-ing this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm just here to try to take us off a cliff.
I should have introduced myself. I don't even introduce myself anymore because we're like, 40 episodes or so in by the time this one airs.
Yeah.
And I should have said, yeah, this is Mike, your Sherpa.
Your Sherpa to the stars.
Your episode Sherpa. Oh, to the stars. That reminds me of Dante. So David has a lot of stuff to do with, so for one, he does want to build the temple. God tells him he's not going to, that Solomon will, but he builds his house not on Mount Moriah where the temple is. Do you remember what mountain he builds his palace on?
Nope.
It's on, that's okay. It's on Mount Zion.
Oh,
now, Mount Zion is going to play an important role.
Yeah.
Mount Zion's going to play an important role with that Jesus guy you were talking about before, too.
I should have just guessed Zion. Yeah.
Because that's the only one I haven't brought up yet.
Yeah, that's the only one left. Yeah.
So, but then before the temple is built, because like I said, David wanted to build it, but God said Solomon's going to do it. But David actually buys the space where the temple is going to be built on Mount Moriah. That's the it's in 2 Samuel, where he buys the threshing floor, where the temple will eventually be built.
Sure.
And then it's Solomon in 2 Chronicles where they talk about not just the building, but the dedication of the temple. And it's on top of that the sacred fire comes at the dedication of the temple too, which we haven't done a fire episode, but we got to do a fire episode too.
Yeah.
Fire in mythology, fire in biblical, fire in theology.
We've done like trees, and now we're doing mountains. Trees aren't, I was about to say it's kind of like elemental, like kind of like Avatar.
Oh, like we need
to
I do have a water episode.
A water episode is real obvious. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wind episode. Anyway, plants kind of fit into that.
Well, we could
not
do like
the wind, but elemental.
Well, like a wind, like a Holy Spirit, like wind, breath.
Well, wind, yeah, no, that would
spirit for sure.
I have ideas. I know what we could do there, but whatever. Anyway,
you wanted to talk about the New Testament, so I should, stop stepping on your toes.
Yeah. So there's lots of mountains in the New Testament in the Gospels, whatnot.
Really?
Mm-hmm. You would be surprised to learn that they
was there a sermon on one of them?
I think there might have been, maybe even more than one. But
we don't need
a pretty
to
famous one. A pretty famous one. The old Sermon on the Mount. Right?
Well, but that's actually because people will oftentimes look. So I know that there's a Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. There's a version in Luke, but the one that in Matthew is the one that most people look to. And what's significant about the Matthew one is that he was the one who every New Testament scholar says he was writing to a Jewish audience. And so what's significant is who was he trying to present Jesus as on the Sermon on the Mount? He was trying to show him to be the new Moses. Mm-hmm. And so what's significant is now Jesus is giving the new law, just like Moses gave the old law. And where was that? On Mount Sinai. Now Jesus is giving the new law on this. And if you go to Jerusalem, it's called the Mount of the Beatitudes. But that's where traditionally it was said that he gave this Sermon on the Mount, at least the Matthew version.
Okay.
So again, it's that kind of parallel.
No, that's 100%. I've heard all that, what you just said too. That he is the new Moses, and the Sermon on the Mount is talking about how the law is fulfilled, and it's not passing away though; it's just fulfilled and things like that. And so he's Matthew as a writer is construing all of this within the context of that Hebraic appreciation for the Torah and whatnot. And as such, being on the mountain there, eventually when you get to the Passion, you're going to get to the Mount of Olives, right? You're going to get to, it's funny, even the Last Supper takes place in an upper room.
Well, and guess where that house was? It was on Mount Zion. So which actually is significant because part of the Jewish tradition about the coming of the Messiah, which I don't know if we want to get too far like down this rabbit trail or whatever, but there's kind of been a lot of speculation, especially with like the Dead Sea Scrolls and like how the version of the Messiah or the Messiah that would be coming, and there would be one coming in the one is the suffering servant, one is the like triumphal like son of David or whatever, and that would be where it would be, you know, from David's house or from the Mount Zion where David's house was, is where he would be ushered in. And what do we see happen in that upper room on Mount Zion? First of all, it's the Eucharist at the Last Supper, but then it's that same upper room where the church, you know, this is kind of seen as the informal birthday of the church on Pentecost. So that is the conquering of the Son of David, is first through the Eucharist, the body of Christ, but then through the body of Christ, the church. And so it all kind of fits together in that same space.
I see. And then obviously Mount Calvary, you know,
which
the culmination of everything, the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate communion with God, you know, on top of a mountain. So,
which some, if you look in some old encyclopedias, they'll say that Golgotha came from Golgotha, which means Mount of Execution.
Yeah, interesting.
But do you know the other name of Golgotha? Like, what was it? What do you always hear about it called? It's the place of
the skull.
Which, do you know the story behind that?
Oh, are you talking about, the idea that it's where Adam is buried?
Yeah.
Like the skull of Adam is. So if you look at Orthodox icons, of the crucifixion, and this is also, I've seen it in medieval art as well. So I know that there's like medieval art that's always depicting this too. But even up until this day, an icon of the crucifixion has the skull of Adam at the base of the cross, like in the ground underneath it.
Yeah, and you'll even see some where the blood of the cross goes all the way down.
Yeah, it's dripping down into
as a
the
sort
whole
of like
symbol
as the redemption
blood covering.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
That goes to like that. So even though, like you said, it's in medieval art, it's in Eastern Orthodox like Christian icons, but that's because it comes from a Jewish tradition. Like that's where, because it was the name before, you know.
Yeah, interesting.
People started writing icons, or people started painting medieval.
It wasn't
pictures.
like a quote unquote Christian invention kind of thing.
Yeah. So, but there again, what's significant is now you have, you know, the first man, and it's his resting place where he died, but it still has this mountain connection, because when we die, who do we meet? Right, from a Christian standpoint, we meet God.
Yeah, I was about to, like, I mean, you want me to say Jesus? You want me to
sure.
St. Peter at the gates, maybe?
Yeah. We don't rehearse this, I know. Yeah. As crazy as that sounds. But actually, to go on that point even further of a burial place associated with a mountain. So there was Mount Bethany, where that was a Jewish Jewish cemetery. They would bury it on the east side, because that's where they thought that God would return. Because if you go into Ezekiel, he leaves his presence leaves the temple and it goes to the east. But they said that God would return, and so that's where they would bury their dead. But it was still on the side of a hill, because again, that's what the hill was. And you mentioned the agony in the garden, right? Which I think is really cool, because that's where, if we're talking about the Passion of Christ, right? In one sense, he started to shed his blood, so to speak, at the Last Supper in the upper room, right, where he gives his blood. But that's where he starts to, you know, sweat blood. That's where he sheds his blood as a sacrifice on top of a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sacrifice begins, right, before he was ever pounded with nails, before he was ever whipped. He was already shedding blood at the agony in the garden.
Mm-hmm. And then once you move past the New Testament, you get into like, all right, so like in the book of Acts, you know, you have the Acropolis scene, right, where Paul's, and that's taking place on a hill, Mars Hill.
Mars Hill, the Areopagus, sure.
Yeah, that's why I said Acropolis, didn't I? Acropolis, of course, is on a mountain because it's a temple, and they always built things on mountains. But Mars Hill, where you have all the communication to the Greeks going on. Rome itself is a city on 7 hills, right? Mm-hmm. So the capital of the world in its time was famously on hills, on a hill populated of hills. Then as monasteries are built, it's just all the time. Like we said this earlier in the episode, they're always being built on hills. And then you did name drop Mount Athos or did you name drop it?
I didn't name drop it. I was waiting for you to do it.
Yeah,
I
you're giving it to me,
set
right? You wanted me to.
I was trying to set you up. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't sure.
I was lobbing it over.
We were
going to
get there. We were going to get there anyway. So now we're there. We're at Mount Athos.
We forgot the Ascension though. Well, the last one the Ascension was on Mount Bethany too.
Oh,
and the Assumption of Mary was on. Oh gosh, is that Mount Bethany too? Isn't there an Orthodox abbey on? It's the Abbey of the Dormition in Jerusalem. I thought it was on Mount Bethany.
I actually don't know that.
Where the Theotokos was assumed into heaven.
Did you take one of those pilgrimage travels to Jerusalem? Is that how you know this? Yeah,
I wish. No, this is just
just good old fashioned research, just good old fashioned prep work, huh?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no,
you're not smarter than me, Mike. You just read stuff more than I do. Okay.
Oh,
so I mean, don't get too high on your horse there, bro. But Mount Athos, I've talked about
too much.
Quit quoting Plato at me, bro. But they so many good jokes, right?
Such a callback.
It's one of my favorite callbacks now, actually.
I almost there was another Plato reference that I almost made. But anyway, keep moving.
But Mount Athos, I've talked about this in previous conversations, is literally what I think the Garden of Eden looks like. I mean, it is tremendous inspiration, obviously to me, to the Christian East as such kind of holds it as our center, so to speak. And if you just look at images of it, it's one of those bucket list trips that I actually believe I will do. There's all kinds of places I want to travel to in my life. Mount Athos is the one that I would place the most money on if it's appropriate to bet upon these types of things. I assume I will actually make that trip one day.
Voyage podcast pilgrimage. Isn't that when you brought it up
right.
before?
We did. That's exactly what we talked about. Corporate overlords. Where is my pilgrimage to Mount Athos? We've done many episodes now.
Mine is the Holy Land, so that's
pretty close. That's just a hop, skip, and a jump.
Oh, I meant
just right across the water.
Oh. I'm just kidding. No,
but anyway, Mount Athos is obviously on a mountain, so mountains everywhere.
Yeah. So, well, that kind of speaks into kind of our last sort of, I guess, wrapping up point, and we didn't even get into a ton of the non-biblical, mythological. We talked a little bit about Mount Olympus, which is fine.
There's Mount Etna, we just kind of dropped it. We just kind of passingly. We barely, because the mountains are everywhere in the Bible.
No, I know. That's the mountains in the Bible is enough, to be honest. And it's that's the most interesting thing anyway. But I did like the connections because we talked about the dwelling place, which we already kind of went into. Mount Etna is where Hephaestus's forge is. And so you have the work of God or the work of the gods taking place on which again, that's what worship is the work of, and I know it's the whole work of the people thing, but it's the work of the people and God, right? That's the whole thing about the Christian worship is that it's both and it's not either or.
Well, this is a really good one too. That's only St. Patrick in Ireland. Part of his story is climbing up the mountain and lighting the fires up there, right? Because they were pagan shrines up there and things like that. I just want that occurred to me earlier in the episode, and I just want to
that'll be our sacred fire episode because that's the same thing with Solomon on the top of Mount Moriah at the dedication of the temple. That's Elijah with the prophets of Baal. Sacred fire on the top of a mountain. Yeah, St. Patrick with the in contradiction to the Druids, same thing. So, but like you were kind of alluding to, or we've both kind of talked about, this is carried on in the Christian tradition, even though it's not necessary in the sense of you could build a church at the bottom of a hill and it's just as much a Catholic church or an Orthodox church, and it's just as much a valid mass or a valid divine liturgy, because like you were saying about the altar, is that the altar itself is the hill. And that and the worship is taking place in, so to speak, it's taking place in the body of Christ. And that's what makes, obviously the real presence so important. That's what makes the valid priesthood so important, is that's where in the same place that the worship was taking place in the Jewish temple, because that's where Abraham's faith was most evident. It was where it was tested and most evident on the rock. Well, now, where was the faith of not just man, but the God-man most present. It was in his body. It was in the sacrifice of his body.
Sure.
And so but we, again, to fit that same symbolic imagery, we'll do the same thing. We'll build monasteries, we'll build churches on the top of the hill. And even though it has that practical value of, yeah, that's the first thing you see, and so hopefully your thoughts are drawn towards God, but there's a reality to this. Symbol and reality, like we've said over and over, they don't conflict. They support each other.
Symbol doesn't mean something fake. Symbol means bringing two things together, but they're really brought together.
And this is one of the big, is that symbols are not only in contradiction to reality, and that's what makes them not arbitrary. That's what makes them have the persuasive value. Not persuasive in the sense of argument, but they actually move you to something.
Organic, natural, human, personable, relatable, right? I mean, relatable is a really good word, actually. Because it really conveys this idea that I have a relationship to this concept. It's relatable because of its relationship to the way I engage with reality as such. So yeah, it's not random at all. Symbolism rarely is. So
no, I think it almost, in a sense, that's what makes it symbolism, is that it is organic or not arbitrary. You know what I mean? It's almost like it can't.
It's not to say that
it can't be a symbol if it doesn't have any sort of deeper meaning to it.
Well, and the reason why we don't always necessarily intuit these things, they become understandable, recognizable, right? Not necessarily intuited, right? A lot of people will criticize symbols for being arbitrary and feeling like they're just made up or whatever, because it's not the same thing as intuiting, I'm standing on the ground right now, right? Or I'm going to fall if I walk off that ledge or whatever. But it is recognizable. It is something that once it's revealed to you, it's sensible to you.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a part of your intuition.
It goes back to what you're saying about eyes to see and ears to hear, right? Symbol is what helps you have those ears to hear and those eyes to see.
And oftentimes they are within the context of the community as such that they gain their power, gain their recognizability and whatnot. And there's nothing wrong with that, because unlike what we're all trained to believe these days, we are not first and foremost individuals. We are first and foremost community members, social creatures. And we should be we should understand that what the community is engaging in is our first priority. Whether the community is doing good things or bad things. If it's doing bad things, then we need to fix it. If it's doing good things, then we need to mirror it and be all mimetic with it and things like that, right? But first and foremost, the symbols of the community are what makes sense to us. And that happens as a result of people living together. The symbolism happens, right? So
yeah, I thank you, Jacob, and I'm going to let you have the last word on symbols and mountains for this one. So thanks for coming in for this conversation. Really enjoyed it. I love talking about, and this was a very heavy biblical one. But I think it'll be cool maybe at some point. This is going to be like a part 2, but where we try to look for maybe some more of those kind of mountain meeting place between,
we can do like a liminal spaces, like a liminal space episode.
Yeah, where we'll bring in more of those pop culture ones. But I like that we got to have a very heavy kind of biblical mountains episode, because it's something that I've actually been knocking around in my head long before we even met each other, is recognizing this pattern and just kind of seeing all the cool things that you can find with it. So thanks, Jacob.
Mike has rocks for brains.
Man, always with always got to knock me down a peg.
Nowhere to go but up from here, Mike.
Oh, all right. Yeah. So, just, I guess, ask you guys to, if you like listening to these conversations, you enjoy hearing Jacob make fun of me, then like and subscribe to the show, leave a 5-star rating. And, we'll keep, coming back with, just lots of these cool kind of, whether it's mythological and biblical connections, biblical pop culture, examples, but it's always fun to talk about these. So thank you guys, and we'll Talk to you later.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.